Hello and welcome to the Americano show. Today we're going to be talking about what the world might look like under the next Trump administration, because since last week and that disastrous debate for Joe Biden on Thursday night, the odds of a Trump presidency have shrunk dramatically, and so we thought it'd be a good time to look at what that might mean in terms of foreign policy for America. And what better person to talk about this with than Elbridge Colby, who is an extremely distinguished American. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development under Trump, and he had quite a large part in that administration's defense strategy. And he's also the author of The Strategy of Denial, America's Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. Elbridge, thank you very much for coming on to Americano. I'll start by asking, firstly, how confident are you of a Trump victory at this moment?
Well, great to be with you, Freddie, and thanks for the kind introduction. Well, I don't pretend to know how the American people are going to decide, but I hope they vote for President Trump, and I think there's plenty of reason to think that they are trending in that direction. I think there was the sense in America, just kind of imbibing all the political news, not all of it, a good chunk of it, was that President Trump may have had a bit of an edge before the debate, but obviously the debate has sort of turbocharged that. And, I think President Biden did very poorly, but President Trump also performed very well. And I think that some of the key themes that we could take maybe for his, future foreign policy, if he's reelected, I think were fairly evident during the debate.
And one of the curiosities of this campaign is that whereas in 2015, 2016, before Trump was elected for the first time, there was a lot of panic, kind of global anxiety about how this chaotic figure might upend the world order and so on. This time, well, of course, you do hear a bit of that. I'd say there's a lot less, partly because, as Donald Trump often points out himself, the world order is in slightly bad state as it is.
Exactly.
So do you think there is a widespread, not just in America, but also abroad, a widespread perception that Trump might not be as chaotic a figure as Joe Biden on the world stage?
Well, let me be clear, first of all, that I don't speak for President Trump or his campaign. And so, the way to get the authoritative message about what he thinks and what his policies are going to be are to listen to what he says. And he has actually put out a lot on his campaign website and in his various remarks and so forth. That said, my own impression on that particular point is the proof is in the pudding in terms of, I think it's essentially indisputable that the record that President Trump has to run on from his first term versus what President Biden is now running on, President Trump's is manifestly better. I don't see how you can dispute that. It's the largest war in Europe that's not going well, that despite all the protestations and the highfalutin rhetoric is not trending in a good direction. Yet we've spent almost $200 billion in massive amounts of weapons. We're falling farther behind, I think, the Chinese in the military buildup. The North Koreans are more aggressive and are now, formally aligned with Russia. Of course, the Iranians are helping as well. Largest attack on Jews since the Holocaust, or largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. The war there has not ended. The Houthis is almost like a symbol of just how sort of pathetic the situation is, that even what's after a tertiary threat, like a fourth level threat, that despite our efforts, has been not succeeded in tamping down. And I think that gets to the fundamental. Biden is almost, I call him sometimes the Indian summer of blobbiness, but I think you also see here almost the reductio ad absurdum of the just wildly ambitious goals of sort of pacifying the world and a crusade for democracy versus the actual means available and how effective we can be. And the Houthis are almost, again, that sort of absurd element. I'd also say, I was at an event in London a few weeks ago, and I say this with respect to the particular gentleman, but he sort of was pointing out about President Trump, how important it is to have consistency in American foreign policy. And I pointed out to him that American foreign policy over the last 25 years, I think with the exception of President Trump's term, is pretty disastrous. If you go back even before, the Middle East wars, the decline of our military edge from the sort of unchallenged heights of, say, the year 2000 to where we're now worried about losing a war with China, the failure of nuclear nonproliferation in places like certainly North Korea, but possibly Iran, deindustrialization, global financial crisis. So I think some disruption is in order. In fact, I hope President Trump, I mean, he said in one of his messages on his campaign website, I believe, that he's running against the sort of neoconservative or sort of establishment. And I said that's great, because that foreign policy was a major failure over the last 30 years. And if we pursue it now, it will be a catastrophe.
Well, you mentioned China a couple of times there. And I suppose one of the key features of Trump's foreign policy has been this willingness to confront China. And one of the bits of praise that some people have given to Biden, and I wonder what your view of this is that to some extent he has continued America's sort of pivot towards challenging China.
I think it's the Biden administration. I think President Trump deserves enormous credit for that fundamental shift towards not only focusing on China, but a more justifiably confrontational approach, because the Chinese were already taking a confrontational and aggressive approach towards us. Places like the South China Sea, the military buildup, et cetera, economics and trade. That's obviously kind of near and dear to President Trump's heart, Ambassador Lighthizer, and justly so. I think the Biden administration has recognized that is where strategic reality is to some extent, but also the political reality in the United States. And they've tried to hug close. In fact, they've basically said that they are continuing but improving on in their telling the Trump administration's policies on China. So in the United States, there's not really so much of a debate about whether or not China is a fundamental challenge. And in fact, I think to the majority of Americans is the top, foreign nation challenge. What I think, getting down to the level of policy and sort of specifics, where I think the Biden administration has really placed its bets is basically the way I sort of, the decoder ring of the Biden administration's policy on China is they're assuming that there will not be a war in the coming years. I mean, Kirk Campbell gave a speech at the Council on Foreign Relations in June, in which he said his concern in the near term is an accident with the Chinese. Because in that sense, their policies on international sort of soft power, economic arrangements, long-term military competition, technological competition, that makes sense because it's sort of a marathon, not rather than a sprint in their view. My view, and I can't speak for President Trump, but I certainly think under his administration, the defense strategy I worked on, the overall approach, and based on where I think a lot of Republicans are, is we'll be lucky if we get to a marathon with China. So yes, we need to qualify for the marathon first, though, because Xi Jinping is clearly preparing for a large-scale conflict with the United States. Whether he does it or not, I have no idea. I don't think anybody really knows. But I think that would be the biggest difference, and that, of course, informs a lot of my policy recommendations and advocacy vis-a-vis Europe, because if you think there's not really going to be a war in the Pacific, then you can supply Ukraine with weapons and resources without constraint, as the Biden administration, I think, would prefer to do. I think President Trump has signaled that there's got to be a change. My own view is that that's got to involve a reprioritization towards Asia. But I think President Trump has, on the issue of Ukraine, for instance, been very clear that the Europeans need to take primary role in supporting Ukraine in their own security, and I fully agree with that.
A trigger for that conflict between America and China might well be over Taiwan. And an argument that's used a lot by, I'd say, the neoconservatives, who I know you're critical of, is that what Biden is doing in Ukraine is important for protecting Taiwan, because it's telling another foreign dictator, in this case Xi, that national borders are important and that they will be protected by the West. What's your response to that argument?
I really question whether anybody actually thinks that Xi Jinping believes that Xi Jinping is kind of like a school pupil waiting to be instructed by the sort of big boys and girls of the West who will teach him a lesson, as opposed to Xi Jinping having a very clear idea of how political reality works and building up the military strength and political resolve to address that issue. And I mean, to me, Xi Jinping's, rationally speaking, his main focus, his main calculation is going to be on whether or not he can succeed. And that, of course, is primarily going to be a function of whether or not we have the military capability to do so. And of course, that does trade against the Ukraine issue, as well as the political resolve, because a lot of people are saying, well, geez, we've spent all this money on Ukraine, and now there's something going on in the Middle East. And what the evidence for this is the fact that if you look at China's behavior, it's far, far more consistent with what I'm talking about. If China which cares more about Taiwan than any other state in the world, recognized country in the world, thought that the future of Taiwan was going to be resolved in Ukraine, wouldn't it do more? Like, why wouldn't it intervene directly? Like, it's such a ridiculous idea, right? It's such a ridiculous conceit that Xi Jinping actually thinks, like, nobody questions that Xi Jinping cares a lot about Taiwan, right? That's, I think, a given. If he actually thought it was going to be, the Russians had to win in Ukraine, at minimum, he would be providing large-scale lethal aid to the Russians, which he's not even doing. Instead, what the Chinese are doing is actually very consistent with what I would fear, which is the Chinese are depleting and distracting us and wearing us out for the decisive blow when they can challenge us, to a boxing match, if you will, at any time. And that, I think, and I know frankly, I find in the United Kingdom, neoconservatism of this kind is still very strong. And I think, we're trying to kind of overcome it here in the United States because we're not in an era when we can pursue what I call primacism, because neoconservatism is sort of it's a little bit of a slur, but primacism, basically the idea that we're the global hegemon. And that attitude, the kind of US and UK doing it together is still strong in the UK. I don't think, again, I'm not speaking for President Trump. I don't think a Republican administration can pursue primacism. We don't have the money. What was the most significant comment in the debate? It was that President Trump pointed out that President Biden is not going to protect Medicare. I mean, it's not on the agenda, large-scale entitlement cuts. President Trump wants to extend the tax cuts. We already have high debt to GDP ratio. Where is that dramatically increased defense spending going to come from? And even if we did get the defense spending, and it's not politically, it's not high on the agenda, and it would take years to pan out even if it did. So we can't even smother the Houthis. And we're talking about China and Russia and Iran and North Korea at the same. I mean, come on, give me a break.
Well, you mentioned primacism, and certainly in the UK, when it comes to Ukraine, there are very few voices in Britain, particularly in politics, who sort of dissent from the kind of opinion on Labour and Conservative side, who dissent from the idea that our strong duty is to defend Ukraine. I wonder what you think of how the Biden administration has handled that conflict, because it hasn't been entirely hawkish, or as hawkish as a lot of neocons or prime ministers would have wanted initially. It sometimes seemed to be dragging its feet. And yet here we are a few years down the line, and it doesn't look like Russia is going to be stopped.
A couple things. One, first of all, I think it's fantastic that Brits across the political spectrum in the UK believe that you should support and defend Ukraine, because my argument is not that all of us should just cut Ukraine off and surrender to Putin. Putin's invasion is an evil act. It's a threat to Europe. My point of view, and I think this is what President Trump suggested in his Truth Social post, is you guys care about that. You're willing to do more. So focus on Europe instead of the tilt towards Asia and the sort of global Britain idea. Focus on something where we don't have the resources. We have to focus on Asia. Even we, with 330 million people, the world's largest economy in market terms, we got to focus more on Asia. We can do something. And this is, this triggers the British security establishment, political establishment. But I think it's just reality. And actually, there's sort of different stages of grief in Europe. But I actually find in some ways the Continentals are farther along in recognizing this reality. It's like, I don't expect when the polls say, well, maybe we won't be with you on China. I say, okay, I get it. You don't have to be totally with us on every issue of China. You have a bigger problem, And what I would say to the Brits on that point, and one of the reasons that I'm critical of David Cameron versus David Lammy, is to say, David Cameron goes around and is basically haranguing us to spend more money and talking about an escalation of the war in Ukraine. But then you look, £3 billion a year, and then, I mean, let's have the same thing I'm calling for in our foreign policy. Let's have a rationalization between what we can realistically expect to aspire to and what we're prepared to actually, put into the money and so forth. So I think that's what I'm, pushing for is a sort of a realignment and a sort of a new partnership, a new bargain where the Americans have to focus more on Asia. That doesn't mean abandoning Europe, but Europe has the ability, has the willpower, as you suggest, to do more vis-a-vis Russia. So let's focus there. To your point about how is the Biden administration done? I think again, objectively very poorly. I think what President Trump said is correct, which is the war did not happen when he was president, which is like my view on foreign policy is a little bit like an investment. I don't really care what what your investor wanted to do. I care about the results, and the results are terrible, not only just in the sense that the war actually broke out, but here we are 2.5 years later almost, and it's going on. And as you rightly suggest, Freddie, it's not going in a good direction. And when I said that 2 years ago or 18 months ago, people would say, oh, you hate freedom, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, here we are. Maybe a little bit more realism. For instance, I don't think Ukraine should be in NATO. It's not because I don't like Ukraine. It's because I don't think we need it to protect our interests. I think we're already overextended. So why would we be issuing additional, commitments? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And then in terms of the conduct of the war, I don't agree with the hawks on a lot of things. I don't think it's net beneficial to us in the sense that the Russians are remilitarizing their economy. I think the trade-offs are much more real than many of the hawks and primicists are prepared to admit, or most of them. Where I do think they have a valid critique of the Biden administration is, look, I am also concerned about the escalation issues, but my goals and my approach to the whole issue would have been very different, much more kind of realist. But how is it that you have the president of the United States saying, I left my heart in Kiev, it's a battle between democracy and autocracy, and then you have this incremental, sort of scared by your own shadow kind of approach? Maybe the best thing, if they were going to pursue this kind of approach, would have been to escalate more dramatically, later in 2022, and then try to make a deal. I don't know. I don't think there was an easy answer. But at this point, now we're in this terrible position where Russia has the upper hand, and now we're authorizing strikes into sovereign Russia. I mean, 10 years ago, this would have been like a ridiculous idea, and now, Putin is saying that he's going to retaliate. So I think that President Trump is right to say, we're on the verge of World War III, and it's not going very well.
Do you think it's a ridiculous idea that Donald Trump can, as he says or has promised, resolve the conflict in 24 hours?
I don't think it's a ridiculous idea. I think to me, this is very similar to what President Eisenhower said in 1952. He was going to, then General Eisenhower, he was going to go to Korea. Richard Nixon ran in 1968 in Vietnam. Ronald Reagan ran in 1980 on the Iranian hostage crisis. I certainly hope he can be successful. I don't know what he has planned, although it's not atypical for somebody to keep their particular strategy for resolving the war. I think it would be better if the war could be brought to an end. So I don't know. My own view, though, is that it is going to be important for Ukraine to be supported in a sort of weapons capability and reconstruction. It's just that the Americans can no longer provide such a substantial proportion of that degree. And people will say, well, the Europeans are doing more. And I say, well, that's great. Well, let's keep moving in that direction. It shows it's possible.
Well, you mentioned the British foreign policy establishment, and I'm sorry to keep banging on about Britain, because I realize there's more important things for America to consider than just Britain's foreign policy. But the British foreign policy establishment was very keen on AUKUS. It's sort of seen as one big post-Brexit sort of successes on the world stage, was forming this alliance between Australia, the US and the UK. When you were talking about China there and, Europe not being less, or Britain and Europe being less interested in Asia, in the Asian region, were you thinking about AUKUS there? Would you junk AUKUS?
Well, what I've said, I look at these things in a very realist, sort of pragmatic perspective. So I have no hostility to AUKUS. To the contrary, these are our two greatest allies. I will just point out that we were close allies with the United Kingdom and Australia before AUKUS was pronounced. So time out on that one, right? But what I say is, particularly Pillar 1, Pillar 2, I think is totally unobjectionable and very important, the technology pooling. But if we go back to the kind of core difference between my view and, say, Kirk Campbell's view, is I think there could be a war. I don't know. I think we have to be prepared for a war in the coming years, in the next presidential term. And what I'm concerned about is the promise versus delivery element of AUKUS, where submarines are conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines are extremely important for a first island chain defense, not to mention in the Atlantic and so forth. So they're very scarce. We have too few of them. Many of them are in maintenance, and our submarine industrial base is in woeful shape. So the notion that we will promise to sell critical assets, even if they're older variants and so forth, during a period that could be a window of substantial, if not maximum vulnerability, already raises alarm bells. And then, the British, there are significant concerns about British shipbuilding capability, the overall state of the British armed forces. Frankly, my view is let's be more realistic about what we can expect from Great Britain in terms of the North Atlantic and that kind of thing, rather than halfway around the world in Australia. So my view on AUKUS, just to be very, very clear, is again, if it were up to me, I would recommend coming in with an open mind, but looking to have these issues practically and credibly addressed. How do we make sure we have enough submarines that are in the right place at the right time? How do we bring our submarine industrial base into a better state? There is money going in, but you'll point out the Biden administration only asked for one SSN this year. Now, partially that may be because they're investing in improved maintenance. Okay, again, it's not a theological thing, but what I worry about is, and this is so quintessential of the Biden policy, and these are the comments I gave to Time Magazine in reaction, it was as part of the article about President Biden's interview, is that it's so much about photo ops and symbolism and leader level meetings, and a lot less about the nitty gritty. Now, AUKUS is an exception. There's some very capable people working on it on all sides to try to resolve it. But at some level, they're not magicians. So again, I would certainly recognize that Australia and the United Kingdom as very close allies, this is a very important political commitment on all sides. So it's not lightly to be tampered with, let alone jumped. But we also need to be able to fight and win a war. And if this comes to a choice between honoring commitments that were made that were not realistic and being in a position of losing the war, right, we're going to make sure that we don't lose the war. And I think that's certainly in Australia's interest as well.
One of the boasts of the first Trump administration, and it was a rightful boast, was that there were no major new wars during those 4 years. You're talking a lot there about a future war with China. How likely is it that you think 4 more years of Donald Trump will mean 4 more years of no new wars, given this growing threat that you seem particularly concerned about?
It's a great question. It's something I've been thinking about. I'm actually writing a speech right now that's addressing this issue. I mean, I am a realist, so I think as a realist and basically a conservative, you have to recognize that in some conditions you have to be prepared to fight. But I will confess that my tendencies are skeptical of military intervention, maybe because I grew up in not just the 90s, but also the 2000s and the era of, I would say, hyperactive and overambitious, military intervention. So I am personally very enthused and supportive of President Trump's, platform of no new wars. The fact that he ran on it. Now, I think he, as much more than anyone, understands that peace through strength. Now, this sort of peace through strength moniker is sometimes just meant so that people can get more money to the defense industry and the military, so they can start wars. But I think if you take it sincerely, and on its real face, I think it is about peace, but through strength. Now, what I would say is, I don't know if we can avoid a war, because at the end of the day, Xi Jinping is the one and Beijing are the ones who are going to initiate this conflict. I personally would be very skeptical about the United States initiating any other conflicts around the world. Obviously, if our allies are attacked in Europe, and contrary to what was reported in the Daily Mail, I would support providing U.S. forces to NATO to defend NATO from a Russian attack, but not those forces that would be needed for a Taiwan first island chain defense. So again, it's a withholding, and that's a we can get into that, but that's a very significant issue. But I'm not a pacifist, right? But I do want to avoid wars. But if we're going to avoid wars, I think actually the kind of mindset and the sort of a general approach that President Trump is talking about is probably the only one that has a chance, because with the Biden policy, you get these sort of gauzy, highly ambitious goals that are untethered to real hard military power in the right place at the right time. So if we wait around, I think if Biden gets reelected, there's a decent chance the Chinese would actually move, or they would basically precipitate a crisis where we would back down because we know we would lose. A kind of an ultimatum of again, I don't know, but I think that's a real risk. The alternative, the primacism approach, is we get, we bomb, we start a war with Iran, we intervene against the Houthis, we start fighting Hezbollah, we impose a no-fly zone in Ukraine, and suddenly we don't have any military forces left to send it. And so that also works to China's advantage. I think what President Trump, maybe, what he's talking about, at least my own recommendation to him would be, focus our military power so there's a clear shield, there's clear strength and denial. Peace through strength. Chinese invasion of Taiwan or other allies in the Western Pacific would not succeed. But at the same time, a moderation to the goals that we pursue. So I differ from my friends Matt Pottinger and Mike Gallagher, the former head of the Select Committee, and Pottinger played a leading role in Asia policy in the Trump administration. They've been calling for effectively a kind of regime change, very sort of more ambitious goals vis-a-vis China, kind of a new Cold War sort of mindset. I'm saying more what you could call conservative realist, which is to say, balance of power, don't mess with us, but we will look for a modus vivendi. And I think that, the fact that President Trump has said he's willing to talk with Xi Jinping, that he's maintained strategic ambiguity on Taiwan, that he's not gone along with the calls for the independence of Taiwan by some in the Republican Party, that's the right policy. Strength coupled with an openness to a modus vivendi.
As a realist, I wonder what your view of the Trump world, the Trump administration's approach to the Middle East is. Because, you look at Gaza and they're a realist. John Mearsheimer, I'd say, is a realist, fairly hardcore.
Not all realists have the same.
But I'd like to see how you differ with him on this. I mean, I think he would say that the kind of realities of what's going on in the Middle East have changed. The Abraham Accords may have been a great breakthrough, but now the situation with Iran is more complex, and he may find himself soon in a situation where he might have to think about or be called on to strike Iran. What would your view of that be?
Yeah. So, I differ with John on these issues around the Middle East and Israel quite markedly. So, but I agree with him on many other things, and I think he has a really important perspective that's heterodox but necessary in this time. So, people can have overlapping views but differ on some critical issues. That's par for the course. I guess what I would say is, and I think this is a really important part, and it gets back to the distinction from primacism, but also the kind of gauzy liberal internationalism of, say, Tony Blinken, is I think we're in a world of tough choices, of scarcity, and of a world that is going to be more characterized by instability and possibly war. And we are not going to be able to solve all the world's problems. So it had become customary. I remember I'd see officials, testifying, for instance, that our goal was stability in the Middle East. I don't think we can expect to pursue stability in the Middle East. And this is one of the sort of things about the Biden administration, like the Jake Sullivan approach. It appears to me they were like, we're going to have a stable relationship with Russia. We're going to have a stable relationship with Iran and in the Middle East. And then we will shift our focus towards China. And it's like, actually, you can't assume that they are going to be stabilized. And by the way, if you condition the shift, you make it more likely they will interrupt it, especially because the Chinese have an investment in that exact outcome. So I think the way to think about it is it could be quite hairy in the Middle East and then possibly in parts of Europe for the foreseeable future. But the alternative of losing a war to China or forfeiting the world's largest market area, Asia, that's not acceptable. So it's kind of like a little bit lowered expectations, but maybe if we have lowered expectations and we're more realistic about our role and how others can play, we might actually come to something better. And that's where I differ with John probably is I would say, let's not assume that there's some, misunderstood Iranian perspective that we can attach ourselves to, but rather if we are going to take less of a role, which I think we have to, then we should seek to empower and in a sense remove the so-called bear hug from countries like Israel, Saudi, the Emirates, and enable them to work. And that's where I do think the Abraham Accords is a very viable model. It's not the end of the problem, obviously. But for instance, in the event of an Iranian movement towards weaponization, for instance, my view has been, look, if the Israelis feel that this is time to do it, we should be prepared to support the Israelis. And we should be prepared to provide them consistent with our own needs in the Pacific with capabilities that would aid them in doing so but they should understand that there are limits to how much we're going to get in. Where we are right now is we're sort of in the Israelis' what's the right word? In their business, deeply in their business about what they're doing in Gaza and Hezbollah. And then we're also enmeshed militarily. We're literally sending aircraft carriers from the Pacific to the Middle East when we can't afford that. And so I think a more supportive and positive, but actually hands-off approach is more in order. And I think the sort of what always comes back to being really important is having a defense industrial base that can support allies that can do more and our own forces. And that's what we don't have. There's been a lot of rhetoric about improving it, but that's where, again, I think the kind of Trump agenda, as I understand it, again, my own view, is that this reindustrialization agenda, because you're not going to have a strong defense industrial base without a more thoroughgoing reindustrialization of our society, because what's happening, we're sending a ton of money to the defense industrial base, prices go up, there's kind of monopolistic behavior, and we get very little bang for our buck. That I think we come back. So to me, if I were recommending it, one of the day one things would be, how do we really bring industry back? And that then connects to the tariff policy and other economic measures that are sort of outside of my wheelhouse. But I think the core is we need to be able to produce weapons and other industrial goods at scale.
Well, Elbridge, finally, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to. You have been tipped as a future national security advisor in the next Trump administration. Is there any truth to that? And would you accept it if offered?
Well, a couple of things I can say with absolute conviction that I'm not the one putting those stories or rumors out there, so I don't know where they come from. And I have no presumptions about making any kind of role. I have no idea what would happen to me. What I will say is, if I could make a good, strong impact, I'd be honored to serve in a second Trump administration. But again, I stress I don't speak for him, and I'm not presuming any role. But all I can say is it's not me seeding those rumors.
Elbridge Colby, thank you very much for coming on to Americano, and I hope we get you on before you might be too busy quite soon.
Who knows? Thank you, Freddie.